Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. On this week's program, what the election of Joe Biden means for immigration policy, the future of migration at the southern border, and what new immigration rules an outgoing Trump administration may still look to implement. All that's just ahead. Stick around. All right, here with me today is Theresa Cardinal Brown. She's Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at BPC. You'll find her on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Hey, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Laura Hall, Managing Director at BPC Action. She's on Twitter at LHallDC. Hi, Laura.
Hi, how are you?
Good. And finally, BPC Immigration Fellow Casey Higgins. Casey, are you on Twitter?
Hi, Jordan. I am on Twitter. Handle is at CC Higgins.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. So let's start here. The election of Joe Biden as president almost guarantees a new path forward on immigration policy. Biden has already pledged to reverse or phase out many of Trump's hardline policies, including halting construction of the border wall, reversing the public charge rule, reinstating the DACA program, and ending the travel ban. So let's dive into a few of the ways a Biden administration may change the immigration policy landscape. Theresa, I'll start with you here. In terms of priorities during the first 100 days of a Biden presidency, what do you think the new administration will choose to focus on?
Well, obviously, there's an awful lot. By one count, the Trump administration made over 400 different changes to immigration law and policy. So there's a lot to do. But I think the Biden administration will focus first and foremost on those things that can be quickly changed or reversed. So that means some of the executive orders, like the travel ban from 2017, the Muslim ban. The more recent bans on immigrant visas or work visas under COVID. Those can be undone by executive order very quickly. He could reinstate the full DACA program very quickly because that was created by a DHS memo, actually, and that could be reinstated fairly quickly. Same with undoing the cancellations of certain temporary protected status countries. Those are all things that could be done relatively quickly, and he has already indicated he wants to do that. The Biden campaign said that they would be introducing a comprehensive immigration reform bill in Congress on day one. Obviously, that's a piece of legislation that Congress would have to take up, so it wouldn't be implemented necessarily very quickly. And then there's other things that might take a little longer. Any regulatory actions that the Trump administration took that are finalized. So, for example, interim final rules on H-1B visas or prevailing wages for those might take a little longer because theoretically they'd have to go through a new notice and comment rulemaking period to repeal those regulations. So that may take a little longer, although they may start that process fairly quickly after they are in office. Last but not least is trying to unravel all of the different policies, programs, and regulations about asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border. That's going to be a lot more complicated because the Trump administration put in place so many different overlapping and sometimes conflicting regulations, programs, policies, some of which could be undone relatively quickly, at least in terms of writing a piece of paper that says we're not doing it anymore, but have significant operational implications for how people are managed when they arrive at the border, and that would take longer.
Casey, the executive action, as we've discussed at length on this show, has been a hallmark of the Trump administration's approach on immigration policy. Will President Biden use his own executive orders to reverse certain Trump policies? And separately, what might his legislative focus be?
Thanks, Jordan. These are good questions. I think on the executive front, part of the reason you saw President Trump use executive action so frequently was because of the inability of Congress to actually pass legislation to achieve some of the goals that he was looking to achieve. I think in some ways you are going to have a continuation of this, particularly if Republicans continue to control the Senate and there's divided government. And I think no matter who is in power, when there is an inability for Congress to make changes, the executive is going to seek to do a lot of those things on its own. So I think you will certainly see, and as Theresa mentioned, some changes to Trump-era executive orders, such as the travel ban, asylum policies, different things like that. And I also think you will see some proactive actions being taken. That being said, I do think there's going to be a push to do some action on the legislative side. Ultimately, And I think most importantly at this stage, you're going to see, I expect, a shift away from comprehensive immigration reform. And for years, this has been something that we have seen Democrats and Republicans at times push, because you can't do one thing without doing everything else. Ultimately, rather than give everyone a reason to vote for immigration reform, it seems that this has actually caused the product to be too heavy and to collapse under its own weight. So I think you're going to see a shift away from this. I think one of the other reasons for that is there's an overwhelming sense that we've had border security as the focus for the past 4 years under the Trump administration, and we haven't done enough in the pro-immigration space. And I think comprehensive in some ways indicates that there will be a compromise on border issues as well. And I don't think that a lot of people are interested in doing more on the border front. And I should say on the Democrat side of the aisle, Republicans will continue to want to have border security trade-offs for various pieces of legislation. I think your focus is going to be on the Dreamer population, on the TPS population, potentially on agricultural guest workers, particularly within the context of COVID, trying to draw attention to them as essential workers in the economy and essential to our economic comeback. And whether you can actually get some of these things through the Republican-controlled Senate, if that's the case, remains to be seen. Although I do think, depending on what happens with DACA executive action, and if there are any further expansions to that the Biden administration does that are consequently challenged in the courts, you could see a push to try to actually get some legislative action on the Dreamer front.
Laura, there's a lot of hope from the left of the Democratic Party and the advocacy space that Biden will take up progressive immigration reform legislation. Given what we know about Biden's moderate approach overall, do you see that as likely? And what congressional hurdles would Biden face beyond those that Casey mentioned?
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of hop on a little bit with what Theresa and Casey were pointing out on kind of the executive order thing. I mean, I think we're kind of going to see this play out in real time, that executive orders don't have a lot of permanency. If Trump put all these things in place via executive order, and some of the top priorities of the Biden administration are going to be to undo these executive orders and put in their own executive orders. If we have a change of administration again in 4 years, 8 years, then those executive orders might be undone. The way to get permanency for changes to the immigration system and kind of for just our country in general is through the legislative process. And maybe this is kind of my background as a congressional staffer coming through, but I think that that's important to get some kind of permanency to our immigration system here. So I hope that Biden, while kind of doing the executive order thing, is going to double track his approach and kind of do a legislative push as well. I think that, as you kind of teased in your question, that's going to be tricky. There's kind of the squabbles and differences of opinion that just happened between Republicans and Democrats. I think we still don't know the results of the Senate, but we know it's going to be closely divided. If the Republicans get the 2 seats in Georgia, if the Democrats get the 2 seats in Georgia, I think it's going to be a closely divided Senate. It's the Democratic caucus in the House lost some seats in the last election, so that's a closer group than they had the last time when they were able to pass a standalone DREAM Act legislation and a few other issues. Apart from the bipartisan problems that they might have, there's intra-party problems too. I think we've seen some of the last week, the debates and questions kind of playing out in the Democratic Party between the more moderate wing and the progressive wing, who wants to double down on some of these policies. I think Biden's camp, while he certainly is, I think, going to listen to the progressive wing in his formed task forces with the Bernie Sanders crowd and AOC and others, I think his heart is kind of in a more moderate place. So I think it remains to be seen where he'll kind of come out on this, but that is his background. I do think there are areas of compromise that seem kind of more universal across the Democratic Party, DACA, as Casey mentioned, and others. But I think it's going to be kind of a little bit of a growing pains at first, while they all kind of adjust to maybe even a new person in the White House doesn't necessarily mean everything I want on immigration. So compromise will still rule the day, hopefully.
Theresa, what challenges will an incoming Biden administration face when trying to implement its transition teams in various immigration agencies? We saw them roll out this week the first tranche of names on those transition teams. What challenges are they going to face in the coming weeks and months?
Well, the initial challenge right away is that Trump has not conceded the election, and therefore the Trump administration has not officially determined that Joe Biden is the president-elect. And therefore, the legal requirements for agencies to allow these agency teams to come in and start doing their transition work has not started. We don't know how long that's going to take. We don't know how long. It's the administrator of GSA that is the one that ascertains that we have a president-elect and therefore opens up both the funding for transition teams and allowing transition teams into the agencies to start doing their work. The longer this plays out, the less time those teams will have to do their work inside the agencies. And the transition team's job is mainly stock taking. Where is the agency? Where is the department on many different issues? Where are there openings that need to be filled? How many positions are there? Who are the people in charge? What are the latest policies? What are the emergencies on the horizon that a new administration is going to have to deal with very quickly? What are the policies that have been in development that they may be asked to act upon or not act upon initially? That's all the work of those transition teams, to try to tee up everything for whoever the incoming new Biden appointees are going to be. And the longer we sit here in this kind of limbo, the harder it is for them to get a real handle on that. Most of the people that have been named to the DHS transition team, for example, have previous experience in government, either at DHS or one of the agencies, or working with them from the outside. So they'll have some idea from their own time period in the agencies what to look for. But until they get in and really see what has changed since Trump administration is there, they're not going to have as good a handle on what needs to be adapted. The other thing that we're seeing, and this is happening certainly at Department of Defense, is that Trump loyalists are being placed in positions that may or may not stick around after the Trump administration. So there's this idea in executive service called burrowing in, where someone who may have come in as a political appointee for one party finds a career job that they then apply for and get, and so that they can stay in through another administration and don't have to leave right away. Given the vast differences in how the Trump administration and a Biden administration view the Department of Homeland Security, that may not be something a Biden administration wants. And so they will be looking at what, who are the people still remaining after a Trump administration, and what positions are they in, and where do we want them? So I do think that for the administration to fulfill its promises in its first 100 days, any delay in being able to get the transition teams in there and look at all of those things will create delays in their ability to actually do the things that they want to get done.
Okay, when we come back, a look at the future of southern border enforcement. Over the last 4 years, the Trump administration has prided itself on its stringent border measures, including a border wall, the Remain in Mexico program, Title 42 expulsions during the pandemic, and increasing asylum restrictions. Apprehensions and encounters at the border have been down significantly in recent months, but if President-elect Biden reverses some of these measures, some believe there could be a new uptick in migration at the southern border. Theresa, looking to Biden's immigration platform, what has he promised to implement at the southern border?
Well, the two biggest things is that he has promised to stop all construction on the border wall, which means that he will not continue to build more miles of border fencing. He has not indicated whether or not he would tear down existing border wall that has been built under the Trump administration. I think that's an outstanding question. He has also indicated that he wants to end the migrant protection protocols, or the Remain in Mexico policy, but again has not indicated how he would process those people who are waiting in Mexico under that program now to come back. So at least on those two key areas, it's unclear exactly how things will play out. With regard to the other asylum changes, as I mentioned in the earlier segment, a lot of those have come under different ways. So there's new programs, like the programs called PACER and HARP, which are basically expedited asylum adjudications at the border. We have no idea if a Biden administration would keep those programs in place. There has been an indication that the Biden administration would withdraw from the asylum cooperation agreements with Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. When and how they would be able to do that and what that would mean, again, a little bit unclear. In terms of asylum, there have been changes to the standards for asylum that have come about from attorney general decisions that overruled immigration judges or the Board of Immigration Appeals. A new incoming attorney general in the Biden administration could reverse those decisions, expanding the eligibility criteria for asylum again. And then the last but not least, there's the regulatory changes. To the extent that any of those are finalized, they would have to be rolled back by notice and comment. Many of them are subject to court challenges right now and maybe have been enjoined. And so maybe an incoming Biden administration would try to settle those court challenges by saying we're just going to repeal a regulation, and that could happen as well. So I think there's a lot of detail here that would have to be figured out. And again, as I said, there's operational implications for that. Just because you change the policy, then you have to have operational procedures as to how you deal with people who arrive at the border under these new or renewed rules. And one thing the Trump administration did not do is invest in those processes and infrastructure at the border. So we still have the same Border Patrol facilities. We still have the cages that exist. If there is a new round of people coming at the border that exceeds capacity, we could have, terrible conditions as we had before. And now you have the complication of COVID. So one seriously outstanding question is how quickly a Biden administration might overturn the Title 42 order by CDC. There's a desire to do so, but if they do so, then they have to accept people and process them in the United States. And doing so under new COVID protocols, we just don't know what that looks like yet.
Casey, what pushback might Biden face from Congress or the American public in trying to achieve these goals on border policy? You mentioned the GOP's continuing interest in border security funding. Does President Biden have a mandate to take a different direction on border policy here?
It's a good question. I think you're going to continue to see divisions between the right and the left on the issue of border security, in particular when it comes to the humanitarian issues. I think there's going to be definitely pushback from Republican circles in Congress on undoing some of these actions, but I also think they will be seeking to work with Democrats to actually pass law. As Laura mentioned, executive orders at the end of the day don't have staying power. And I think there is still interest in finding a path forward, particularly when it comes to how to deal with these surges on the border. What will be telling, and I think what will gauge how much pushback you're going to get from the American public in particular, is whether there is another surge on the border. We have recently seen those numbers decrease. Historically, they've decreased based on the time of the year, but I think also this year, a combination of the pandemic, as well as some of the President Trump's policies have probably helped to decrease those numbers. And as the pandemic hopefully soon starts to subside and there's a new president in the White House, I think the question is, do we see those numbers increase again? And is there another surge? I think that's when the public tends to get a little bit more involved and louder on these issues. But, as we've seen, since the 2014 UAC crisis and subsequently since then, when there is a surge on the border, there is renewed conversations within the halls of Congress on the best way to address these issues. And so far, frankly, we've failed to, in Congress, pass reforms that can actually address these issues, allow the administration to respond quickly to them. And I do think while a lot of these issues are controversial, there is middle ground that Republicans and Democrats can find on a variety of topics. But the one that comes to mind immediately, too, is judges and increasing the infrastructure at the border to be able to process asylum seekers when they are coming across the border. So there are things that are very bipartisan that can be done. And I think, Republicans will be anxious to see whether the president is going to be able to come to the table to try to negotiate those if there is another crisis at the border.
Laura, what about pressure from the left on border policy? We saw reports this week that the number of children who are still waiting reunification with a family member is over 600. Do you expect that the congressional Democrats, especially those on the far left of their party, are going to be pushing President Biden to focus early and hard on some of these issues?
Yeah, I think pressure will be strong. I think a kind of we've seen, as you mentioned, the reports that there are still some families that have been separated for various logistic reasons. I think the pressure will be very strong for them to kind of figure out if there's ways to reunite those families, kind of figure out kind of where the children belong, that kind of thing. So I think pressure is definitely going to be strong to kind of work towards some of the family reunification. I think at the same time, there's certainly going to be pretty strong pressure not to go in a little bit of a different direction in terms of the family separation policy and enforcement at the border. I think it will definitely be an internal conversation with the Democratic Party to, if we see a bit of a surge again, how to address that situation. I think we saw big divisions emerging, balancing kind of the enforcement needs with the humanitarian needs. I think that will continue. So I do think there will be pressure on a Biden administration to talk internally with his caucus to figure out the best path forward there.
Theresa, coming back to something I introduced at the beginning of this segment, is a rush of migrants to the border during the first year of a Biden administration possible? I mean, I suppose anything is possible, but does that seem likely to you? And will a new administration be equipped to handle such flows?
I think, yes, there will be some more migrants coming to the border, in a Biden administration. There was news reports over the weekend of cheering in the migrant camps along the U.S.-Mexico border when the news that Biden had won the election came out. So they clearly see it as positive for their prospects. We also know that COVID has taken a significant hit to the economies of Mexico and Central America. And those push factors, those reasons that people choose to seek better lives in the United States are bound to increase. And so I do think that as borders reopen a little bit, maybe as COVID restrictions lift, but even in spite of that, you could see more people just feeling the need to migrate to try to improve their lot. So I think it's highly likely that we would see some increase in migration to the U.S.-Mexico border in a Biden administration. As to whether or not they will be in a position to manage that well, I think going back to what we said in the last segment, transition matters here. There has to be operational protocols in place that everyone down at the U.S.-Mexico border knows exactly how they are to treat and manage and accept and process new arrivals to the border, what rules are in place, should they claim asylum or if they're not claiming asylum. Clarity on all of that, and then dissemination of those protocols and operational guidelines to the frontline personnel is absolutely essential. And the later it takes for Biden's people to be in the agencies to try to prepare all of that, the longer it will take until there is a sort of a clear direction given and process for the frontline people to have. In terms of infrastructure, no, we don't have any different infrastructure really at the U.S.-Mexico border than we had at the beginning of the Trump administration, other than some temporary facilities which are still available to them, but which are not ideal. We have not added more immigration judges to hear cases. And so, it's not clear from a resource perspective and an infrastructure perspective, how they would manage those flows. Would they be going back to what's called catch and release, where they would process people as quickly as possible, release them to nonprofit agencies at the border and let them carry on to their place? That I know the Biden administration wants to do more alternatives to detention, more things like family case management. But again, that requires an influx of resources and nonprofit capability to manage and do all of that. And some of that has diminished as the flow at the border has diminished. So it would have to be built back up again. So I do think the potential for some bad pictures, frankly, at the U.S.-Mexico border is possible, but it can be managed, and a lot will depend on how the Biden administration responds to that.
All right, after the break, what the Trump administration may still look to do on immigration policy. With President-elect Biden not set to take office until noon on January 20th, 2021, there are still a few months for the Trump administration to shore up its immigration priorities. In October, for example, the administration issued 2 interim final rules regarding H-1B visas, making it more expensive for employers to employ H-1B visa holders, and introducing more restrictive definitions of a specialty occupation. Theresa, what additional policies could we see rolled out during the final months of a Trump administration?
So one thing we have heard already is that there is additional H-1B regulations in the pipeline that the administration wants to try to push out before the end of the year. Again, it seems to be mostly about prioritizing the most highly educated, highest skilled, and highest paid applicants for H-1B visas in that pool of 85,000 that's available each year. So I think that that is one rule that we're likely to see. I think there'll be a significant push to try to finalize any pending or interim regulations that are out there. Other than that, there's a few other things that are still out there to be looked at. There were some regulations about restricting who can get employment authorization documents, for example, that we haven't necessarily seen yet. I think there are additional things that would change the requirements for withholding or asylum that the administration would like to see finalized. They may push to have some of these court cases that are outstanding, appeal them as quickly as possible to the Supreme Court and see if the Supreme Court will take them up so that they can be finalized and put in place before a Biden administration comes in. We'll have to see how well the courts will acquiesce to that desire. But I think that there's certainly operationally inside the agencies, one concern is just further hollowing out of the agencies as people start leaving. Usually towards the end of administration, many people who maybe have been political appointees start looking for other jobs as soon as possible and start departing. There's usually an attempt by the outgoing administration to try to keep people there as long as possible. We may see some of that. And, whether or not there are additional people who just are tired of having gone through a lot in the last 4 years and want to leave their positions. A lot of immigration judges retired or departed the service over the last 3 or 4 years, and building that back up is going to be difficult. So those are the key things that I would be looking at in an outgoing Trump administration.
I want to hear from all three of you on this, but Casey, I'll start with you. What do you think the Trump administration's legacy on immigration policy might be?
I look at this 2 different ways. First of all, there wasn't significant legislation passed while Donald Trump was president in the immigration space. And I think a lot of what you're going to see in terms of, whether there's a lasting impact will be, I think memories of child separation and the travel ban and things like that. But there won't be, from a policy perspective, I think necessarily a lasting impact in terms of the policies that he put in place. The other thing I want to touch on, and the other way I think about this, is where the Republican Party is on immigration generally. And I think you look back to, let's start with post-2012 and the autopsy after President Obama's reelection, and then the desire among Republicans to move forward on immigration reform. And then you go back before that to 2006 under President Bush, there was a strong push to try to reform our nation's immigration system. And while there are still, I think, plenty of Republicans like myself that view immigration through a free market lens and really want to get in and solve the problem and think that legal immigration is good, I also think you've seen Republican positions on immigration change a lot in the past several years, particularly because of the change in the base. And a lot of that is driven by the president's position on immigration. And I think for Republicans in general, it's going to take us a while to get back to the Bush days of, free market capitalism and in the immigration context. So we're going to have to work on that for a while. So from my perspective, as I've been thinking through this, I think that's the legacy that will be left from the president on immigration. And hopefully, we can move quickly beyond this and get back to a point where we're trying to fix the system to work for the economy, to work for the American people, and, also to protect American workers and to secure the border, all things which, even in the Bush days, we still supported doing. But like I said, I think it's going to be a while for us to recalibrate on this issue.
Yeah, Laura, from your perspective, what do you think?
Yeah, it's going to be kind of echoing what Casey said a little bit. So I think the most lasting kind of impact of the Trump administration, I think, is going to be unfortunately the divisions that have popped up on this issue. Immigration used to be a place where not everyone agreed, but there used to be places where people could come together, whether it was around agricultural workers or high-tech workers or the DACA population. And just because of the president's fiery rhetoric, not necessarily his policies, but his fiery rhetoric, I worry that this is almost a bit of a third rail issue that Congress is loath to tackle, similar to like gun control and abortion and things like that folks' positions are so strongly tied to their identities and who they are as a party. So I think that that's something that the lasting legacy of that we might be feeling for years to come. Are there going to be places for common ground? Certainly. But is this going to be a place where lawmakers, because of the president's positions, are going to feel a little reticent to step in on? I do worry that that's going to be kind of where we are for a little while.
And I think I'll echo both what Laura and Casey said. I think in terms of policies, some of the policies will be overturned fairly quickly in a Biden administration. Others may take a little longer. Certainly just the overall outlook on a Biden administration toward immigration is going to be very different from what the Trump administration had. I do worry about the opportunities for bipartisanship, but again, Biden has said he wants to try. And he has a history of working across the aisle. He has a history of moderation, of finding the way to a deal. And so I think if anyone is capable of bridging the divides, at least on areas of common ground, probably not comprehensive, but specific areas, I think Biden is a person who could probably try to make that happen. The other thing that I think the Trump legacy might pass along is that Trump and his administration managed to find every possible place in existing immigration law to push the boundaries toward enforcement, toward restriction. He used the 212F authority expansively in ways that previous administrations and presidents either never considered or considered and ruled out. And so now that it's sort of known that those authorities exist, and many of which have been upheld by the courts, that might be a place where Congress is willing to come together a little bit and say, did we give the executive too much authority there? We're seeing that in other areas like the tariffs that President Trump threw on the trade area. So there might be bipartisan desire to roll back some of those abilities to unilaterally issue tariffs. I know there was concern about some of the authorities that existed under previous presidents to essentially conduct military or kinetic operations overseas without congressional authority. Now we may see immigration as one of those areas where Congress is going to look at it and go, maybe there's just too much discretion over there and we need to pull some back. That could limit what a Biden administration or a future administration can do to quickly, 180-degree swing immigration policy in this country. But again, it would require Congress sort of coming together and Biden agreeing to do that. And so that's something that's to be determined. But I do think that this administration found all of those little known, little understood, we know Congress had this in there, but we didn't think any president would be bold enough to use it authorities. And there's a president who is bold enough to do that. He's now broken that barrier, and future presidents could do so also. And so I think that's something that people will be paying a lot closer attention to.
All right. That's a great place to leave it for today. Theresa, Laura, Casey, thanks to you all for joining me. This Week in Immigration will be back in 2 weeks, but after more than 80 episodes together, I'm saying so long for the last time. Thanks to you all for listening over the years. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite platform. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Rachel Iacono and myself. Yafet Tawahara produces and edits our show, and the executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Ashley Swearingen. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.